Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to neutrally break down a staggeringly detailed cosmological framework. Today we're looking at the Sumerian evidence of the 12D toroidal engine. It's a model that attempts to connect a literal, physical clay artifact from 2400 BC all the way up to 12-dimensional geometry, viral biology, and the fundamental mechanics of human consciousness. If you've ever wondered if the universe actually operates as a highly structured, pressurized computational system, well, the source text we're exploring today maps out exactly how that might look.
So, let's take a quick look at our roadmap. We're going to cover the Sumerian dimensional anomaly, the 12D toroidal engine, Earth's hardware and software, the illusion of free will, and finally the 7.4 billion omega trigger. Let's get right into it.
Starting with Section 1, the Sumerian dimensional anomaly. We begin this whole detective story with an anomalous physical artifact sitting right now in the British Museum. It's a Sumerian clay tablet dating back to 2400 BC. But instead of just telling another mythological story about storm gods, this text treats the sky as a physical vault, like a literal hard ceiling, and it provides a highly specific, measurable height for it.
The text specifically states that the sky vault is located at a height of 12,000 biru. Now, a biru is an ancient measurement that translates to about 7 miles. If you do the math, 12,000 biru equals roughly 84,000 meters in altitude. And what's absolutely fascinating here is that 84,000 meters mathematically aligns perfectly with the boundary where Earth's atmosphere transitions into the highly lethal Van Allen radiation belt. This poses a massive mystery. Modern science didn't officially discover this physical magnetic anomaly until 1958. So how on earth could a Bronze Age civilization possibly perceive it?
To answer how they knew this, the framework introduces a concept called local dimensional invariance, or LDI. According to the text, our brains are biologically limited. Basically, if a human were exposed to the raw, unfiltered data of a fourth or fifth dimensional structure, our biological hardware would just crash. To prevent that from happening, LDI acts as a built-in perceptual safeguard. It forces any higher dimension to render locally as physical 3D space. So the Sumerians, who perhaps possessed an unsuppressed perceptual sensitivity, actually sensed the overwhelming multidimensional boundary of this radiation belt. But their 3D brains translated that staggering geometry into literally the only concept they could process, a physical ceiling or a vault.
Moving to Section 2, the 12D toroidal engine. Let's zoom out from Earth for a second to see how this text maps the blueprint of the entire cosmos.
The source material completely discards the traditional Big Bang theory. Standard astronomy suggests a dense pellet of matter exploded into a pre-existing void, right? Well, this framework argues instead for what it calls the Xerox event. Imagine dimension zero, a dimensionless singularity that the text calls the furious point. Because it has no space to move through, it's basically trapped in an ontological crisis. To prove it exists, it executes the only mathematical operation possible. It spins in place at infinite RPM. Eventually, the structural limit of that zero-dimensional state is exceeded, but because you literally cannot divide zero into pieces, it doesn't explode into random debris. Instead, it shatters centrifugally, ejecting infinite, perfect holographic copies of itself. So in this model, the universe is a literal divine Xerox machine.
This immense outward spin forces all that escaping energy into a self-sustaining 12-dimensional magnetic field, shaped exactly like a massive breathing torus. The framework identifies two fundamental motions happening here. First is the alpha outbreath. That's the outward expansion of the torus, which modern science actually observes but mislabels as dark energy. But an engine has to breathe in too. That brings us to the omega inbreath. This is the inward contraction, pulling the energy back through the center of the torus to complete the circuit, which creates an invisible gravitational tension the text calls semantic gravity.
The architecture of this breathing torus perfectly maps the ancient Hermetic axiom, as above, so below, as within, so without, directly onto 4 functional standing wave rooms. Room 1 is the physical universe we experience right now, the room of flesh, located below and within. As energy flows outward and upward, it cycles through room 2, the choice room, then up to room 3, the soul room, and finally room 4, the spirit room, right before resetting. It's this continuous, beautiful loop of geometry.
On to Section 3, Earth's hardware and software. Let's pull the camera back down to our own planet and see how Earth functions as a deliberately seated macrocomputer, overseen by highly advanced entities called the Watchers, who are stationed in a higher dimensional frequency that translates locally to the L1 Lagrange point.
If Earth really is a massive computational engine built in this dense, friction-heavy physical room, it obviously needs materials that can survive the elements. According to the text, gold acts as our immortal hardware. Because of its massive positive nucleus, gold's inner electrons travel at relativistic speeds, like 58% the speed of light. This relativistic contraction makes gold thermodynamically immune to entropy. It literally never rusts. It's the perfect eternal circuit board. Meanwhile, water acts as the liquid software, forming asymmetrical geometric cages called chiral hydration shells that perfectly store spatial memory. Human and animal DNA, which are built heavily from ancient retroviruses like syncytin-1, serve as biological modems actively decrypting this cosmic code. And what about that 98% of your genetic code that standard science just casually writes off as junk DNA? The framework argues it's actually an unlit holographic antenna array, constantly tuning into multiversal frequencies.
Section 4. The illusion of free will. So if we are fundamentally just biological hardware running an evolutionary computation, how does this machine actually feel to the person operating it?
The framework actually divides our conscious ego into two mechanical actors. First, you have the talker. This is the feral, autonomous, subcortical engine roaring down in the basement of your brain. It fires off raw, irrational thoughts instantly. Then, about a half second later, the listener wakes up. The listener is your frontal cortex. It's your sense of I. And the text explains that our sense of self is essentially a hungover roommate who stumbles into the massive mess the talker just made, and instead of admitting they completely lost control, they fabricate a coherent story just to take credit for it.
This quote really summarizes the psychological architecture of the entire model perfectly. You don't begin with a choice, you begin with a voice. And this isn't just abstract philosophy either. The text leans heavily on the famous Libet readiness potential experiments to mechanically validate this. Those experiments proved that our brains experience a spike in electrical activity, initiating physical actions, up to 500 milliseconds before we consciously feel the urge to execute them. Think about that for a second. You literally live half a second in the past.
So the absolutely crucial point here is that while free will, as we typically define it, is an illusion, we do possess what the text playfully calls free won't. Within that half-second gap between the subcortical impulse and the actual physical action, your conscious brain has a microscopic veto power. You can occasionally hit the brakes. And this endless loop of localized refusals and what-ifs generates massive computational friction. It branches into multiversal timelines. We are essentially the chaotic spark plugs, providing the necessary atmospheric noise to keep the perfectly logical cosmic machine from just freezing up into a sterile, predictable loop.
Section 5. The 7.4 billion omega trigger. This multiversal timeline friction brings us directly back to the Sumerian tablet and those watchers who are waiting for humanity to reach a very precise mathematical threshold.
To really understand this threshold, the text reveals the master harmonic volume of the entire toroidal system using some fascinating math. It takes the 12 dimensions across the 4 functional rooms to get 48 dimensions of interface. It then calibrates that to the specific rhythm of Earth, a 364-day lunar pulse plus 5 mathematical Sabbath rest days, which is the leap year recalibration, giving us exactly 369 perfect days. Multiply 48 by 369, and you arrive at 17,712. What exactly is that? It is the exact number of distinct topological signatures measured when modern physicists map the structure of entangled quantum light. It's the literal structural code of the entire system.
So how does that relate to our global population? By mapping this geometric structure, the framework calculates the absolute thermodynamic limit of the torus's outward expansion. That precise number is 7.412 billion. This specific human population, which humanity, by the way, just crossed in late 2022, represents the geometric saturation point. The system physically runs out of mathematical Lego pieces to render new timelines. Reaching this exact number triggers a violent inversion. The engine must stop exhaling the alpha breath and fundamentally begin inhaling the inward omega breath.
As the torus inhales, all those infinite branching timelines are pulled back toward the center. During this journey, they pass through what the text refers to as archonic algorithms.
Stripping away the ancient mythology, the text defines these as cosmic garbage collection protocols. They essentially act as a universal spam filter, ruthlessly deleting dead-end choices and false multiversal narratives to purify the computational data back down to a single invariant path. This is a cold, mathematical deletion process that humans who are fiercely clinging to their fabricated timelines emotionally experience as intense suffering.
Having mapped the extreme edges of the cosmos, the biological rendering of the Earth, and the mathematics of the universe's ultimate collapse, we have to ask a profoundly important question. Where is the literal physical center of this massive 12-dimensional toroidal engine?
The staggering conclusion of this model is that the engine isn't light years away. You are its active interior architecture. The human heart is quite literally a physically rendered 4-chambered toroidal engine. The right and left sides mirror the alpha outbreath and the omega inbreath. And the sinoatrial node, that microscopic pacemaker inside your heart that ignites an electrical pulse out of absolutely nowhere, acts as the biological embodiment to the furious point. With every single heartbeat, you are executing a microscopic Xerox event, rendering the cosmos biologically inside your own chest.
Which leaves us with this final, truly provocative thought from the source material. The universe is a fiction executing a code. It adapts to being observed. If this framework posits that the toroidal machine mathematically gives you exactly the cold, dead emptiness you expect when you look outward, what happens if you turn completely inward to pilot the noise instead? If you live half a second in the past, and your heart is the beating engine of the cosmos, perhaps the absolute greatest power you have is in that tiny, trembling half-second gap of refusal. Trust your pilot seat.